Friends, if you missed last week, I asked a question. I asked us all, are we left to our own devices? Given the situation that the mainline Protestant church is in today, given the situation that the Abbey United Church of Christ is in today, in the midst of all the decline that we're facing, numbers, money, you name it, are we left to our own devices to pull us out of this problem? And last week we said, no. We're not on our own. Now what? Okay, we're not on our own. Now what do we do? Psalm 85 says, "Let me hear what the Lord our God will speak." Let me hear what the Lord our God will speak. May I offer this to us, our friends, this morning, that the thing that we should do is wait and listen. And listen. Listen for what God will speak. That sounds simple enough and maybe quite, religious, easy to say, that we'll wait for God to speak. But if we really want to talk about this, maybe sometime after church as you're enjoying lunch, you may look to your family member, your friend, and say, I have no idea how God speaks. How does God speak? How do we listen to God? Now, the story about Jesus walking on the water offers us an answer, and that may seem unlikely. The story about walking on the water, what does it teach us, if anything at all, about hearing God? After all, this story is super familiar to all of us, right? You've heard it. If I could take a poll and ask everybody to talk about, can you name some of the miracles of Jesus? I guarantee you that you'd probably mention last week's feeding of the 5,000, and you'd probably talk about walking on the water. You'd probably mention those things, right? It's familiar to us. We know this story. It's one of the things that we talk about when we want to claim Jesus' divinity. Oh, Jesus can walk on water. And it becomes so familiar that even these days, our culture outside of the church has embraced this idiom, this expression of walking on the water. It's a familiar phrase these days. When we talk about walking on the water, most of the time we mean two things. Two, we can talk about the way that someone is infatuated with someone else. Like, that person's so into that person, it's as if they could walk on water. Right? That's one way. And the other way is to express doing the impossible. Oh, you want me to walk on water? Right? You want me to do something. You want me to fill these pews like it used to be. Impossible. That's walking on the water. And when we take that familiar interpretation and we apply it to our present circumstance as a church that is really looking for answers, then what comes out of that is that, if we just have enough faith, and if we just believe, then we too can do the impossible. We can walk on water, just like Jesus. And then, when we embrace that interpretation and we apply it to our lives and to our present circumstance, all of a sudden, we find ourselves sinking. Just like Peter. We run out of answers. We might even fail. We're left to our own devices. We tried to walk on water, to do the impossible, and we missed something. We didn't hear something. Or maybe we were distracted by something. What's distracting us? Let's revisit this story again and consider something. It's easy just to get focused on all look at your bulletin, right? And you see that Jesus walking on the water. It's easy just to take that image and make that the central interpretive moment of this story. We just want to focus on Jesus walking on the water and maybe Peter trying, right? But I want to say that let's not forget the context, everything that's happening around this story, right? That what's happening here, actually, is a whole lot more than just Jesus walking on the water. What's surrounding this story, friends, is anxiety and chaos. Previously, we've learned that Jesus has just suffered the loss of his relative, his partner in ministry, John the Baptist. John the Baptist has been murdered. And Jesus, fearing for his life, has gone out on the run, fleeing, going out into the wilderness. He goes, and then the crowds follow him. And it's not just any crowd, it's a bunch of hungry people, hungry, needy people. So there's been murder, right? There's a hungry crowd. There's Jesus running for his life, and the disciples too. And then all of a sudden there's a storm, and we're with the disciples in a boat, and the wind is raging, and it says the boat is battered by the waves. And in the face of all this, we're starting to feel the chaos. You can feel anxious in all of this, right? You get caught up in all of that. And it's kind of like scrolling through your phone, your news feed, and you read story after story after story of murder, of storms, chaos, loud. It starts to get louder and louder, and all of a sudden your head starts to get full, and it's busy. And you find yourself, you can't think straight anymore. You had that experience? That disorientation? The way in which our technology invites us into a storm, a certain type of chaos? You've had that experience? And what happens in the midst of all this disorientation, this chaos? Well, we learn in the story that the disciples, all of a sudden, they can't see Jesus anymore. They're in this boat. The storm is raging. The wind battering, the wind howling. And all of a sudden, they can't quite see Jesus anymore. They say, "It is a ghost." They can't recognize Jesus. And more than that, they can't really hear him either. Jesus says, "Take heart, friends, it is I." But nobody really seems to recognize the voice. And when you can't really see Jesus and you can't really hear Jesus, all of a sudden you can find yourself acting a little bit haphazardly, making decisions that maybe you otherwise wouldn't make. And then, so Peter decides, I can't see Jesus, I can't hear Jesus, I'm going to go out onto the water and join Jesus out there. I'm going to do the impossible. I'm going to walk on water. You start acting a little crazy. Friends, have you had that experience? In the face of all the noise and the chaos in your life, the constant bombardment, the overstimulation, you ever tried to make a good decision in that moment? My teachers are over here. They're nodding. They know what it's like when the classroom is in chaos, when there's all this noise. It's hard to keep your cool. It's hard to make a good decision. Or maybe you know this at being at home too. You know those times. You know what I'm talking about. When that energy and that anxiety, that volume starts to raise, all of a sudden you start acting in ways that it's not yourself. Unfamiliar. You're distracted by all that noise. And so when we start to act a little crazy, we join Peter and we start to step out of that boat a little bit and walk upon the water. And when we get out there and we are outside of ourselves, then we look around and we notice what the problem is. We notice that our attention has not been on Jesus. In fact, it's been on all the wind, that's been around us, all that's distracting us, the chaos. That's where our attention really is. And we find ourselves sinking, distracted by the wind and all the noise. And we too start to sink. The story doesn't end there, of course, friends. But you'd think that Peter would finally recognize Jesus at the very moment when Jesus reaches out his hand and saves him from the water. You think that would be the moment when Peter would say, truly you are the Son of God, you saved me. Right here on the water. But that's not where it happens. Peter doesn't make his confession there on the water, in the midst of the storm, in the midst of all the chaos and distraction. Where does Peter and the disciples recognize Jesus again? Where do they recognize Jesus? When do they actually hear him? In the silence. In the silence. Once Jesus gets into the boat, the storm ceases. It's quiet. It's still. They can hear it again. They know they can recognize Jesus. And they say, truly, you are the Son of God. It's in the silence that Jesus is known, heard, and then faithfully proclaimed. Now, friends, I know what you're thinking. Practicing silence today in our world, you might as well be asking me to walk on water. That seems impossible. That seems like an impossible task. And we could all sit here and make countless excuses on how we don't need or we can't practice silence in our lives today. You can make those excuses, right? Maybe you would say, well, Will, practicing silence is against human nature. It's just against human nature. We need each other. We need to communicate. We like the noise. It's an essential part of who we are as human beings. I recently came upon a story about the quietest place on earth. And it's a place in Minnesota. Who would have thought? Maybe that's what you were thinking. Minnesota. And it's a place called Orfield Laboratories. And there's a scientist there who has created a quiet room. And after many years, he's finally perfected this room to where it registers a negative decibel reading. That means that it's below what the human ear can perceive. That's how quiet it is in this room. And for a long time, the record was 45 minutes for a human being to kind of stand this environment. Someone would go in there seeking silence, and they could only last about 45 minutes before they started to go crazy. And I thought, oh, wow, that's amazing. That's fascinating. That's the limit? 45 minutes? That doesn't seem very long. But then I started to think about it, and I was like, wait a second. There are people that have endured silence for much longer than 45 minutes. I have family members who are deaf. And for them, silence isn't this disorienting thing. In fact, silence has become a source of strength. It becomes a friend. So I don't know if it's really part of our human nature that we need to be against silence. It seems that there's something else in play here, and it may just be our own cultural conditioning, right? So it's not against our human nature, but it certainly is against our culture these days, right? It's against our culture to practice silence. In her book, Susan Cain wrote this book called Quiet. Maybe you've seen it, come across it, I recommend it. And in this book, she talks about the way that our culture has prioritized noise, extroversion, if you will. And that we, as a culture, will often equate rightness and trustworthiness with volume and velocity of speech. So the more someone is talking and the louder that someone is talking, the more likely we are to follow them and believe they're right. And then in the 1920s, there was a shift in which we started to see ourselves as a people that needed to be more sociable, that needed to connect more. And this great shift has then compounded with technology to the point where now it's about attention seeking, and the louder you are and the more you can put yourself out there, this seems to be the ideal. And you might say that silence is really against our personality. We have anyone that would call themselves introverts in the room? A few? Yeah, I know it. I see you, Louita. Now, all the introverts are quietly rejoicing of my talk on silence. But then there are the extroverts in here like, uh-oh. Uh-oh. I can't sit in silence. That's against my personality. That's not who I am. Very well. Let's not forget, friends, that we are human beings in need of balance, and that we need a whole wide range of experience. Don't allow yourself to be categorized and to think that you are defined by a certain list of what extroversion may mean or introversion may mean. We are complicated. And we somehow fall along this spectrum. And you, no matter how extroverted and social you may be, you still need that moment where you can experience quiet and stillness. And finally, practicing silence is against our experience. I don't think I'm wrong if I can assume that for many of us, a moment of silence can be uncomfortable. That if we're quiet for too long with ourselves, it could be a scary type of experience. Things start to bubble up. And we rush and we wonder and we try to turn on something, right? Need to talk to somebody, need to turn on the news, need to listen to music. And we have another expression in our culture, right? Awkward silence. Where it's this experience is as you're connecting with somebody, that silence in the midst of that connection is not allowed. It shouldn't be, right? If there's a void in the moment when you are relating to somebody else, that's a bad thing, and that you need to fill that time. It's awkward. Does it have to be? You ever had the moment when you can sit down with somebody and you can enjoy the silence? You don't have to say anything at all. You don't have to do anything at all. You can just be. It's a sweet moment, isn't it? Those moments help us befriend silence. They help us welcome silence back into our human experience. But I want to challenge us to welcome silence back in a few other ways. I want to say that we need to first change our expectations. I spoke earlier about the extrovert ideal. We need to go against this messaging from our culture that extroversion, that volume, that velocity, loudness, attention, that all of that is what makes us right and trustworthy. We need to counter that message. We need to change our expectations culturally. And we also need to change our expectations theologically. We need to stop thinking that God is an extroverted God, that God only speaks by medium of sound. We have this expectation, right, that God will speak through the reading of the word only, through music, through a sermon. That this is the only way that God can speak to us, through the voice of another person. We limit God into only being an extroverted God. And then we too as a church think that we need to be extroverted too. That we need to start talking too. And that we need to do more volume, more noise. And all of a sudden, the church starts to become a very noisy place, right? And you get bombarded with stimulation. And it partners with everything that you experience outside of here, right? With the news, with your social media. And all of a sudden, church is just another voice adding to all the noise. We need to change our expectations. And friends, we need to trust. We need to trust that God speaks in the silence. The witness of the scripture this morning says that God is not in the wind, in the earthquake, in the fire, in all the noise, and all the chaos. That God is in the sheer silence. Jesus himself, in his ministry, whenever he experiences anxiety or conflict, you will find in the Gospels that Jesus will go to a lonely place. That's where we find Jesus in this story before he walks out on the water. Jesus on a mountaintop alone. We can follow Jesus in this practice. Let's trust the witness of our scripture. And we can also practice silence ourselves in our daily lives. I have intentionally tried to practice silence this week a number of times. And it's kind of fun. And I want us to kind of embrace this kind of playfulness about silence. I want you to see how long you can actually sit still and quiet. Don't judge yourself. Laugh at yourself when you can't sit there for more than 30 seconds to a minute before you feel that need to go and do or that need to go and hear something. See how long you can make it. You won't come close to 45 minutes. I promise you that. I was sitting in silence this week, and all of a sudden, the thing that comes up in my brain is a bunch of songs from 80s classic rock. Stuff that I didn't even know was there. All of a sudden, it's not like I just listened to it or something, but you start to realize all that stuff that is in the background of your life that you're not really noticing, that's really there. You start to let that stuff kind of come out. And I can let go of Foreigner Feels Like the First Time. Right? And all that other music. And sometimes you find yourself thinking about something and you're like, wait a second. Why am I thinking about that? Why am I holding on to that? And that, friends, becomes your invitation. At that moment, God may be speaking to you. So be curious and be playful as you practice, and be regular too, if you can. And finally, friends, you'll notice that in our practice of silence, we are incorporating that into our worship. Has it been awkward for you? Was it awkward earlier? I'm standing up there. Well, it's getting a little quiet here. Lean into it. It's awkward, yep. But let's take that as a challenge. Let's take this opportunity to allow the practice of silence to be part of our worship and part of our witness. That we can provide a space for our community, that we are not going to offer just another place where you can experience noise and chaos, but you, friends in Huntington, Central Pennsylvania, you can come to the Abbey. You can sit. You can worship. You can be quiet. And when we find ourselves being quiet, all of a sudden, we may find ourselves walking on water. Because walking on water, friends, doesn't mean doing the impossible. To walk on water means to have stability when there is no stability. To walk on water means to have stability when there's no stable ground. And how do you get that? But by being still, being silent, and waiting for Jesus to speak, "It is I. Do not be afraid." And then you will know the words of Isaiah, that in quietness and trust shall be your strength. And that, friends, together as a church, we can then proclaim in the silence that truly Jesus is the Son of God. May that be our witness to Huntington and to our world. Amen.